Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello and welcome to this edition of the program. Our interview today is with a very important guest. He is John Holmes, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the United Nations. Before we talk to Mr. Holmes, let's have a report about his life and the different positions he's held through the years.
John Holmes, British diplomat. Sir John Holmes, GCVO, KBE, CMG, was born in Preston in the north of England in April 1951. Following his education at Pearson Grammar School at Balliol College, Oxford, he entered Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1973. After spending 3 years as a desk officer in London, including a period of temporary duty at the British Mission in the UN in New York, he was appointed to the British Embassy in Moscow and the 3rd Secretary Chancery and subsequent promoted 2nd Secretary. On returning to the FCO in 1978, he first took up an appointment in the Near East and North Africa Department before becoming Assistant Private Secretary to the Foreign Secretary in 1982. In 1984, Holmes was posted to the British Embassy in Paris as First Secretary, Economic. He returned to London in 1987 as Assistant Head of the Soviet Department, and between 1989 and 1991 he was seconded to Thomas de la Rue and Co before moving to India as Economic and Commercial Counselor at the High Commission in New Delhi. He returned to London in 1995, first as Head of European Union Department in the FCO, and then as Private Secretary, and subsequently Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister. Between 1999 and autumn 2001, John Holmes was ambassador to Portugal. He had been ambassador to France since October 2001. In January 2007, he was appointed Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator by United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Honors and personal life. He was awarded the CMG in 1997 in the resignation honors list of former Prime Minister John Major for his service as Principal Private Secretary. In 1998, he was appointed CFO, and in 1999, he awarded the KBE on the recommendation of Tony Blair on leaving the senior job at number 10 Downing Street, a higher honor than normally bestowed, because of his work on the Northern Ireland peace talks. In 2005, Queen Elizabeth II prompted him to be a GCVO at the conclusion of her state visit to France, celebrate the 100th anniversary of Etienne Cordial. In 1976, he married Penelope Morris. John and Penny Holmes have 3 daughters, Sarah, Lucy, and Emily.
Hello and welcome back. Mr. Holmes, let me welcome you to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and let me ask you first about the visit, the purpose of your visit, and what other countries have you visited during your tour?
Well, I'm starting a tour of some of the Gulf countries here in the Kingdom, which is often known as a Kingdom of Humanity, so I think it's a particularly appropriate place to start the tour. And what I'm hoping to do is to talk about the humanitarian demands we face in the world, the millions of people who are in need throughout the world, and to talk about how we can strengthen the partnership with the Kingdom, but also with the other countries of the Gulf region in tackling these challenges and in meeting these problems. I think the important thing in a way is that The idea of helping people in need, the idea of helping people, whatever their religion, whatever their politics is, these are shared values between all religions and between all countries. And that's why we need to work together to make sure that the humanitarian effort is for all countries and for all peoples, and by all countries and all peoples. And that's the kind of issue I'd like to talk about while I'm here and while I'm in the region.
Well, I believe you're going to meet the custodian of the Two Holy Mosques, King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, and many high dignitaries, the foreign minister and the finance minister and others. Well, tell me why and the kind of agenda that is prepared for these meetings and what you wish to come out with.
Well, as I say, that my main agenda, I'm looking forward very much to seeing His Majesty, the Custodian of the Holy Mosques, and the other very senior princes and officials I'll be meeting. And what I want to talk about, as I say, is to reinforce the partnership in the humanitarian area. It's very important that we work together. The Kingdom has a very proud record of generosity in many causes and gives a lot of money to causes. We would like to reinforce the partnership with the United Nations system in general, but also with the international humanitarian system. I think a lot of the effort that is made bilaterally to countries in this region or elsewhere can be complemented by this multilateral effort. Mm-hmm. The point is that when we're acting multilaterally, when we're making appeals for wherever it might be, and many of these of course are Islamic countries, the occupied Palestinian territories, Sudan, Somalia, wherever it may be, we're also having a strategy to help these countries and planning the strategy and prioritizing the needs. So when the effort is made multilaterally, I think it can be effective and complement whatever is given bilaterally as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're taking over from your predecessor, Jan Egeland, when you were nominated by Ban Ki-moon in January 2007. Well, tell me about places you visited during that time, challenges that face the United Nations and the universe in general during the time you've been in office.
I think we have a lot of challenges. We're trying to deal both with the effects of conflict on people, civil wars or wars in general, but also natural disasters. So we have both man-made and natural disasters to deal with. If you look first at the natural disasters, what we fear is that the demands on us from a humanitarian point of view are going to go on rising because, first of all, because of the effects of climate change, where we can see that there are going to be more and more intense natural disasters, floods, droughts, hurricanes, cyclones. This region itself was the victim of a very fierce cyclone last year of a very unusual kind. You can't say any one event is linked to climate change, but this is the pattern we're seeing, the trend we're seeing throughout the world. And this is creating more victims and therefore more needs for us to address. So that's one part of the agenda. And those issues are being made worse at the moment by a structural rise in food prices throughout the world, which is creating, I think, more hungry people, but also, and is going to do more of that in the near future, but is also making it more difficult for us to deal with because the resources we have don't go so far in buying the food that those people need. So that's one whole set of challenges we face in the coming years. Then, of course, there are the conflicts, as I was saying earlier, and I have visited very many of them in my first year as the emergency relief coordinator. Mm-hmm. I've been twice, for example, to Darfur. I've been twice to Somalia. I was hoping to go to Iraq to see the situation there for myself earlier this week, but unfortunately the recent events there made that difficult. I visited the occupied Palestinian territory, both Gaza and the West Bank, a few weeks ago. So the Democratic Republic of Congo, Africa, unfortunately, is a scene of many of these problems. So all these issues are causing us problems, are posing great challenges, need great resources, and have to be tackled in a very coordinated way. And the responsibility of my particular department of the United Nations is to coordinate that effort, both from the United Nations agencies, but also from NGOs, from the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, to make sure that we're addressing it in as coordinated and strategic a way as possible.
Mm-hmm. I haven't mentioned the occupied territories, West Bank and Gaza. I believe you visited West Bank on the 16th of February, I think, this year. And you've seen the siege of the Gazians. And you had watched on YouTube, by the way, some of your remarks when you said that this siege, this very tight noose stranglehold on Gaza is not going to turn people against Hamas, which is very much contradictory to misconceptions in Israel and other quarters. What do you think of the plight of the people in Gaza, and is this going to continue? And tell me about UNRWA. Is it doing enough?
Well, I think the plight of the people of Gaza is desperate because they are under siege. They are suffering a kind of collective punishment for the rockets that are being used by Hamas against parts of southern Israel. They are the ones who are suffering. They are the innocent victims of this. And simply not enough goods are getting in to make life at all tolerable for them. What we are trying to do is to make sure that some more goods do get in, so that at least they can have a minimum level of tolerable life under the terrible conditions they're living in. And what we'd like to see, of course, most of all, is an end to the violence, because that's the source of the problem. And, of course, a proper, comprehensive peace settlement with two states living side by side and peace. That's the only way out of this at the end of the day. But it was depressing to visit there. And I think we need to do everything we can to get more goods into Gaza. I also went to the West Bank, as you said, and although living conditions there are much better, that also presents problems in the sense that the settlements are continuing to expand, the barrier is there, the regime of closures is there, and so those realities on the ground make it hard to be optimistic at the moment about the prospects for a peace settlement, although I very much hope that such a settlement will come on very soon.
How about UNRWA? It's been in place for over 50 years, and it seems that it's a lifeline to the Palestinians. And even though we've heard last year there was reduction in the number of staff working for UNRWA, and maybe resources weren't enough. Is this one of the challenges that you are facing?
I think UNRWA does a fantastic job, and has been doing a fantastic job for 50 years in dealing with the Palestinian refugees to the best of their abilities. And if it wasn't for UNRWA, for example, the people of Gaza would be suffering much worse than they do already, because 80% of the population of Gaza at the moment are dependent on outside assistance from UNRWA and to some extent from the World Food Programme. So I think they do an excellent job. They're always in need of more resources. The reduction in staff was a rationalisation of their administration, not any reduction of their effort. And they're not only working in Gaza, they're working in all around the region where the refugees are. But they face a lot of problems. They face the problem, for example, in Lebanon of the Palestinian refugee camp, which was destroyed because of the fighting there. They need to rebuild that. They've launched an appeal for that. That's a very worthwhile cause too. But I think they are an essential part of the scene, and without them, the whole region will be much poorer and in much greater difficulty.
Okay, Mr. Holmes, you report on these different hotspots, and you present your report to the United Nations Secretary General. How does it progress from there? Is it presented to the Security Council? Do member states have a say on this? Could the United Nations apply certain chapters in the Charter that would enforce countries to get together and try and do something to alleviate the suffering of people in disaster?
Well, of course, I do report to the Secretary General on all these issues, and particularly when I've been on a visit to one of these areas, I produce a report for him which sets out very clearly and honestly what I have found. And usually I also report directly to the Security Council. So, for example, after I'd been to Gaza and the West Bank, I went on and reported on what I'd seen in a very direct and straightforward manner, which I think was appreciated by the Security Council. Now, it's for the Security Council after that to decide what they want to do about it. They have the power to use Chapter 7 sanctions or whatever other methods they want to use, or to pass resolutions and to call on countries to do things. That it's beyond my power to force them to do anything. We can make recommendations, but in particular what I try to do is to tell the story as I have seen it and I have experienced it on the ground, and that's usually a very powerful message.
Now, the United Nations, and I'm sure in your capacity you notice this very much, sometimes the United Nations lacks resources because there's so much money is needed to alleviate the suffering of people in disaster and in emergency relief. Well, we know Saudi Arabia is one of the countries who pay up on time. But did you face problem with other countries who owe a lot of money to the United Nations, and how could we get them to cough up the needed money to help people somewhere else?
Well, there are several questions in there. Part of what you're talking about is the regular budget, where every country has an assessment, an assessed contribution. As you say, Saudi Arabia has always been a very reliable and regular payer. Some countries have been less so. We've had some problems in the past with the US having difficulties with Congress about payments, although most of those I think are now resolved. Mm-hmm. But the regular budget only goes so far in dealing with the Secretariat and its staff. What we also depend on to a very large extent is voluntary contributions. The office I run depends 95% on voluntary contributions, both to run itself and to run the Central Emergency Response Fund, a new fund which was set up a couple of years ago to make sure that there is a rapid response to crises of whatever kind there are, and there is also fairness between crises so that politics doesn't enter into it. We respond purely on the basis of need. All that is dependent on voluntary contributions. And what we would like to see is that the burden of those contributions is fairly shared by all countries, according to their prosperity and their interests, of course. It's up to them, so that we have the resources we need. There will never be enough resources to deal with all the problems in the world, but we need to have a basic minimum to deal with them. As I say, one of the things that concerns me is that with climate change and the rising food prices, we may face some really difficult choices later this year or maybe next year as our resources begin to run out.
Mm-hmm. And humanitarian values are a human kind of value shared by all faiths and people of the world, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's why the humanitarian effort is a universal effort. It's a moral imperative for everybody. We are giving help to people irrespective of their religion, of their political affiliation, of their ethnic background, or wherever they may be in the world, whether living in a conflict zone or whatever. We will deal with all people we need to deal with in order to do that, and we will help everybody according to their need. And I think that's a principle which is enshrined in the great religions. It's certainly enshrined in the Islamic religion, and that's why these values are universal, and why I think the effort should be a universal effort.
Mm-hmm. John Holmes, there's so much disasters around the world, and they seem to increase as days go by. You have so much on your plate. Like, for example, one of the issues that's been gaining momentum in the past few years, and now it's slowing down a bit, is the problem of landmines. After different wars, there are landmines which end up crippling young children, losing limbs and organs if they step on a landmine, and there are problems from World War II until the recent conflicts. How bad is that problem, and what's needed to try to eliminate landmines globally?
I think it is a very severe problem in some countries where conflict has been present for many years. Afghanistan, for example, Iraq is another example. Obviously the occupied Palestinian territory, Lebanon, as a result of the conflict 2 years ago, where the place is still littered with cluster munitions which were dropped at the time. So there are very severe problems. The day we're speaking is actually Landmine Awareness Day, International Day of Landmine Awareness. Mm-hmm. Now the international community is making a big effort through the UN, but through NGOs and other agencies, to try to rid the world of landmines. Most landmines have been banned already. There is an effort to ban cluster munitions, which are another kind of unexploded ordnance, which does cause enormous problems, particularly for children when they pick them up thinking they're toys.
And they were used in Iraq and in Lebanon.
They've been used in Iraq and Lebanon, and there are very large numbers of them still lying around which need to be cleared. Now, you need to have peace in an area before you can properly clear them, and it takes time, it takes effort, and it's dangerous work. But I think there needs to be this twin effort of making sure we ban the kind of munitions which are most dangerous and are not militarily necessary, or have effects which go well beyond the military, and a reinforced effort to put out the resources, human and material, to get rid of the scourge of landmines once and for all.
Now, one another troubled spot that you visited was Darfur. And we know there's always a problem with the African peacekeepers there, or United Nations peacekeepers, but people who are displaced, people suffer a lot. Tell me about Darfur and how things are progressing. We hear movie stars, we hear politicians, everyone's talking about it, but little seems to have been done towards the people themselves.
Well, Darfur is the biggest single humanitarian operation in the world at the moment. It's something like $1 billion a year operation with 14 or 15,000 people on the ground actually trying to help the people of Darfur. And the problem is, because of the fighting, because of the ongoing problems, there is a very large displacement. 2.5 million people are displaced in Darfur. Probably more than 4 million people are in need of some international assistance of one sort or another. And that is 2/3 of the whole population of Darfur, to give you some idea of the scale of it. I think the humanitarian operation has been successful in that we have managed to keep people alive. People are not starving to death, they have decent conditions, they have some medical care, they have some shelter. The problem is for us that humanitarian efforts do not solve the problem. The problem can only be solved politically. There needs to be a political solution, there need to be political negotiations, and that process is frankly dragging on much too long. We also have a peacekeeping force there, a hybrid African Union United Nations force, which is still in the process of deploying, still needs to build its strength up further. And I hope that will provide a more peaceful environment for the people and for the humanitarian efforts. But I say at the core of it is the need to find a political process. And it's actually true everywhere. It's true in the Middle East peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's true in Iraq. It's true in Somalia. If you don't have that political peace process and that political solution, the humanitarian effort is only keeping people alive, and even the peacekeeping operation can't properly work unless there's a peace to keep. So that is fundamental, and that's why we're working very hard to try and get the government of Sudan and the rebels to sit down at the same table and negotiate a lasting solution.
What do you do about your personnel who've been kidnapped and subjected to different atrocities, like in Somalia, for example? Two of your staff were kidnapped a few weeks ago, and also in Darfur. What is the United Nations doing about that?
Well, one of the things we try to make clear to everybody is that they should respect the neutrality of humanitarian workers who are there with no political agenda, are simply trying to help people in need. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. There are these kidnappings. They may be for ideological reasons, they may be for money, or sometimes a combination of both. Being a humanitarian worker is dangerous. Large numbers of humanitarian workers are killed all over the world every year, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Darfur, kidnapped and suffer from these problems. Now, we try to resolve the individual problems, and we are negotiating at the moment with those who are holding the two people you mentioned in Somalia, and I hope we'll be successful. Very often we are, sometimes we're not. But as I say, people, the humanitarian workers, whether they're from NGOs or from the UN system or wherever they're from, feel the need to go out there and help despite all those dangers, and I salute their courage.
Now, since we're talking about displaced persons, Iraq seems to pose a very important problem now. There are millions of people who left the country, and all efforts to try to stabilize the country and get people to go back to Iraq has been futile, and many of them are living in neighboring countries. What is the United Nations doing to help them?
Well, what we're trying to do, there are two things really. One is the Iraqis who have left Iraq, and there are very large numbers of Iraqis in Jordan, in Syria, and in some other neighboring countries. We are trying to help the governments of those countries to absorb and to deal with the extra burden they have with those refugees. So we've been helping through the UNHCR, the governments of Syria and Jordan in particular, for example, by helping to strengthen their existing health and education systems to deal with the extra burdens that are put upon them by the extra populations. Obviously, we all want to see those Iraqis go back to Iraq. Unfortunately, I don't think the conditions yet are there for them to go back in large numbers, although we would help anybody who did want to go back. But meanwhile, we will try to help the governments deal with them in as reasonable a manner as they can. And then there are problems inside Iraq itself. As you say, more than 2.5 million people internally displaced in Iraq. more than 1.5 million in the last 2 years since the particular problem started with the bombing of the mosque in Samarra. And what we're trying to do there is, despite the security problems in Iraq, which are very, very severe for international staff to work there at least, is to make sure that UN agencies and NGOs and the international Red Cross and Red Crescent movements can help them, can deliver the food and the clean water and the medical supplies they need, working with the Iraqi government, who also have the prime responsibility for this, so that we are addressing those problems. We're not doing it perfectly, we know. We are trying to scale up our efforts. We launched a significant appeal for resources a couple of months ago for $265 million to help the people inside Iraq, and I think many donors are responding very generously to that appeal.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the beginning of the program, you mentioned the Kingdom of Humanity, and we call the Custodian of the Two Holy Mosques the King of Humanity. He's known for his humanitarian endeavors. Many non-Muslim and non-Arab children, Siamese twins, have been operated upon here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And of course, just a couple of days ago, the Custodian of the Two Holy Mosques also spoke about dialogue between religions, and this goes to show the humanitarian nature of the Custodian of the Two Holy Mosques, which in turn reflects very much on your mission as United Nations Secretary General for Under-Secretary for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief. So I hope that the meetings with the Custodian of the Two Holy Mosques and the different Saudi officials will find identical viewpoints for the welfare of humanity in general.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to those meetings, and as you say, His Majesty the King is known as the King of Humanity, and with good reason, for all the reasons you're talking about, particularly work with children. I think that's why I hope we will find a good consensus of views and a good partnership to work together in the future to deal with some of these terrible humanitarian problems which exist all around the world.
Well, one final question. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he had very strong words against people who produce films, cartoons, things of the sort to defame or to tarnish the image of Islam or any other religion. How do you view these kind of smear campaigns against Islam and Muslims?
Well, I think, as the Secretary General made clear, the particular film he was talking about was purely irresponsible and not based on fact. Of course, there is freedom of expression, but freedom of expression must be exercised with responsibility and with respect for others and their religions, whatever those religions may be. So I think the Secretary General made that very clear, that he disapproved completely and condemned absolutely the production of this film. But he also called for restraint in responding to it, because it's not in any sense typical of views elsewhere in the world, and therefore should not be, as it were, given too much seriousness, because it's an aberration.
Mr. John Holmes, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the United Nations, thank you very much for giving us the time for this interview.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank our viewers as well for being with us in this edition of the program. And as you've seen, we had Mr. John Holmes, who is the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and also Emergency Relief Coordinator for the United Nations. Thank you for being with us, and until we meet again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.